Yeah, for sure. I think we've done a good job at highlighting different challenges in this panel. We talked about misinformation. We talked about just these different, the fact that the establishment is so ingrained in consuming meat and dairy. I think I'll touch on both of those briefly. So the misinformation, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. The narrative that I've heard across all generations, from 15-year-olds to 50-year-olds, that has been so successfully done by the meat and dairy industry, is this idea that plant-based alternatives are processed. And so there's this whole conception that because there's different ingredients on the back of a Beyond Burger, that it's not healthy, it's not natural, it's processed, it's artificial. And I think we're gonna see the same narrative come out with cultivated meat. They're going to try to spin it as something unnatural and scary. And I think the solution is, as you mentioned, like those of us that are talking to the politicians that are in the establishment, to have the facts ready to be able to counter that, but also to really think systematically about how can we push news articles that are covering the real facts about this? How can we make things more transparent and clear? And also, how can we shine a light on the fact that this is misinformation, that the meat industry is actually intentionally putting this narrative out there? I think the raising awareness of the truth is going to be really important for that. So I think that is going to be one of our biggest challenges, is countering the misinformation. The second challenge around the establishment and how they continue to consume meat and dairy, and I wanted to tie this a little bit in with just environmentalists, because we like to think that environmentalists, the people working on the climate change issues, they all know about this and they're taking action and they care and they are aware of all of this. But even though they might be, even though maybe they read an article in the New York Times about the fact that red meat is bad, they aren't really taking action on that information. And I read this post on LinkedIn once that said, you can tell it's not really an education issue when you see all these Teslas parked outside of a steakhouse. And that kind of shows that disconnect of, like, you know, people care about reducing their environmental impact, but they're still going to a steakhouse. And it's really like, how do we get to the core of people's decision making? And that brings us to this idea of how do we change people's decision making. And I think that's something that we can all as a movement continue to learn about and continue to educate ourselves on that specifically. And Natal does a good job of that. He's always sending me articles about books and different recommendations of how social change happens. And I think it's just patience, and it's also working at the systemic policy level. So I talked about default veg previously, and default veg is basically when you take the choice away, in a sense. You make the default something that's already good. But thinking about solutions like that, maybe working with universities and educational institutions about making their menu more plant-based, whether it's 60% plant-based, 40% not plant-based. These kinds of institutional shifts, I think, are really important. And then also talking to the establishment where you can. Like, I think those of us that are able to have connections in the environmental movement should do our best to always be stewards of the information that we know. So like you mentioned, Public Policy Forum, or these like larger organizations and events and conferences, I think it's us going there and talking to people and continuing to spread the right information that's really going to change things.
Thank you, Nika. I really like your point about raising awareness of the truth. I think really that's where